Interesting. Well, welcome everybody to Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and as you can see, I'm joined with my good friend William Albrecht and Master Apologist Extraordinaire Trent Horn. Welcome, William. Welcome, Trent.
Great to be here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite a while.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was neat to finally do the debate with Steve on the Deuterocanonicals, and it's a real treat here in this episode of your channel to debrief the debate that I had on the Deuterocanonicals with him, especially with you guys, because I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants here. As part of my debate prep, I examined your previous debates and interactions with Steve to formulate my replies in the debate. So your guys' work was incredibly helpful in that regard.
Cool. Yeah, I think I met William once, and I met you, Trent. I think I'm the only one that qualifies as a giant as far as stature, but I don't know about intellectual stature though. But thank you, appreciate it.
No, your work's been very helpful, and so I mean it's a very intricate subject to address with the Deuterocanonical books of Scripture. I mean, Gary, I really consider myself a jack of all trades apologist. I mean, I have some areas that are a big area of expertise for me, like the issue of abortion, because I was doing that kind of apologetics before I did Catholic apologetics in general. So I'd say I have a decent amount of expertise in that area. But many of the other issues, I'm relying on other experts to supplement knowledge and have to do debates across a wide variety of topics. I think William can appreciate this as well from the variety of topics he's covered in debates. So that's why it's so helpful to have people who've intensively studied the subject to be able to go to as resources.
Yeah.
Yep, I totally agree. Yeah, as you probably know quite well, Trent, I've debated a number of topics as well. It's very helpful to be able to look towards, in my opinion, I think Gary is the top when it comes to this kind of material. His books are fantastic. The shows he's done are great. I love tuning into Virgin Most Powerful Radio to hear Gary talk. You know, I always learn something new all the time when I get to hear Gary. But even hearing your debate, I have to admit, I learned even new things there. So I appreciate the very kind comments. But yeah, even hearing your debate, you did a good amount of preparation there. What I really appreciated was you dug into the early church, and you hearkened back to what I would call the golden chain, as Thomas Aquinas would call it. It goes right back to the head, to Christ. And you went to what the apostles would have really held near and dear to their hearts, and that would have been Holy Writ, the Scriptures, and the
right.
Canon. They frequently quoted it, not merely quoting it offhand, but quoting it as sacred Scripture. And I really kind of made me pick your brain. I wonder what, in your opinion, coming from it, as you call yourself a jack of all trades, I'd agree completely. What would you say would be perhaps the most difficult thing about that part of the debate, and maybe kind of reaching out to other people that might not know really the intricacies of the Deuterocanon, or these 7 books, if you will?
Well, the difficulty, William, of the Deuterocanonicals and making our case for that is that it actually stretches a long time span across a variety of documents and disciplines. So we're really stretching from the end of the exilic era in Israel's history, going through the Maccabean history, apostolic age, post-apostolic age, all the way up really to the 16th century, where you're dealing with about 2,000 years of history that get brought up. And it did get brought up in my debate with Steve. In fact, his opening statement, which I found to be surprising, was he began his discussion with a discussion of the Council of Trent and alleged contradictions between it and the Council of Florence and Carthage about its identification of the canon. And so you are covering, the disciplines you're covering are ancient languages, ancient Hebrew manuscripts, ancient Jewish sources like the Talmud, the church fathers, the patristic age, the conciliar texts. So you have to have there's a wide gamut, and it's easy when people pick off. And I think what Steve tried to do is he didn't really make a positive case. He wanted to start with something that requires a lot of qualification, and that will be the conciliar definitions of the canon to try to like score points on like a kind of technicality.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and maybe I want to kind of piggyback off of what Gary does very often. And Gary and myself, we talk about it very often. But the importance really of going to the very heart of the material, not second or third hand material. And I think you did that in your debate, rather than relying upon what one author has said, that another author said, that another author said. You went directly to the source material. And I think when we do that, when we kind of pull back the veil on the Deuterocanon Canon and what the fathers said, I think the Catholic case is very clear. What do you think about that, Gary?
Yeah. Well, actually, piggyback on what Trent said, that shocked me too, because he had the affirmative where he needed to demonstrate the Protestant canon is true. And none of the stuff in the opening statement in regards to those councils have anything to do with the issue. I mean, the council, like you pointed out in the debate, the councils could be wrong, but that doesn't prove that the Protestant canon is correct.
Right.
Yeah. And a lot of secondary sources.
What Steve does in his debates, Gary, that I find to be interesting, and I see what he's trying to do, and I do something similar to this in my own. Like if you read in my book, The Case for Catholicism, I often make many citations of Protestant scholars that affirm, and you guys do it too in your own work. If a Protestant scholar can affirm my point, that's a good thing to do. Like, for example, if you're arguing the papacy, if you cite D.A. Carson, who says, look, there's no verbal distinction between Petros and Petra, the rock that you're founded on. So you cite like Carson or John Calvin. And then that's helpful because, look, you've got someone, it's like your book, Hostile Witnesses, Gary. It's like, you wrote a great book on that. You get someone from the other side who affirms that point. And I think Steve tries to do that, where he'll cite just like kind of random secondary Catholic sources that are really more popular level sources to try to affirm aspects of his case that many times I would say, well, it's not a good citation because it's actually not a great source site. It may be Catholic, right. But it's not the best scholarship, or it's really outdated scholarship on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, he cited like John Martinoni, Michael Voris.
That was the one that killed me. He cites Michael Voris on the, Michael Voris says it ends at Malachi, and it's like, well, obviously, Michael Voris does not deny the inspiration of the deuterocanonical books of Scripture. He's not a deuterocanon specialist. He's just making a shorthand reference in another context to the end of the Old Testament prophets. And so to draw, you're right. So it's either popular level Catholic stuff now, or academic stuff like New Advent that was written like in 1906.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and compare that to the secondary sources you used, like Otto Kaiser, you used McDonald, you used people that are experts in the field.
Yeah, and that's a point that I drove home in the debate later on, saying, like, when I was citing the sources making claims about the Septuagint, making claims about the use of the Septuagint and the Deuterocanonicals among early Christians, secondary sources are helpful because they help bring in the level of expertise to say, this isn't just my opinion about the primary sources. There are other qualified experts who would agree with me. So like with the Septuagint, I quoted one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook of the Septuagint. And, so I believe, and that's one thing that was disappointing me about Steve's book, that when I went through it, except for MacDonald, he really does not engage the wide variety of scholars on this issue. Even in my studies for this, Gary, I went through a wide variety of deuterocanonical sources, and it was surprising what I found. Like, for example, I was reading Andrew Steinman, who wrote a book called The Oracles of God on the Old Testament canon question. And it's interesting to see the different scholars' positions. So, like, MacDonald would take the view that the Old Testament canon was closed late into the Christian period. Steinman is more conservative and holds that it was closed, before Christ, but he doesn't go back as far as like Ezra as as Christie does, and he rejects the Abel-Zechariah bookends argument. So there, like when I quoted Steinman basically agrees with you, Steve, but he rejects this whole Abel-Zechariah bookends argument, so it's not going to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have the source problem, and I mean, it's apples to oranges as far as popular works to scholarly works. I wonder why he did that. My own impression is, I think he's trying to attract Catholics so that he's mentioning names that they may be familiar with.
Right.
But he would be much better off citing, like you did, some sort of standard work, especially when he's trying to nail down historical facts.
Right. And I mean, if he was really good, I mean, he could go find moderate Catholic scholars that might agree with him. He could go and try to find who is it's blanking on me a second. Birth of the Messiah. Raymond Brown. Or someone like that. And that would be a good tactical move on his end to find that, or a John Meyer or something like that. But you're right. I think, Gary, that one, he wants to try to get things that people will appeal to, but also, frankly, looking in his book, I feel like the research, it was just not really in depth beyond, kind of internet research versus actually going into these academic monographs.
Yeah, I agree. I think he tried to wedge people's ignorance to his side because, like you said, the topic of the Deuterocanon covers all sorts of disciplines, lots of specialized study. And by touching on all these different subjects, the audience that probably will never look into it would be impressed just by the sheer number of accusations. Where I know you probably felt the same way I did. I was a little bit dizzy because I look at all the different things he says and it just doesn't square. It's
right.
Yeah.
And that's what I tried to do although in my rebuttal, I tried to be prepared for that. And this happened to me similar in my debate with Dan Barker. And when Williams debated Barker as well, he has a tendency to do this. When I debated Barker in Minnesota, I knew from his previous debates, he would do the shotgun. It goes by different names, the Gish Gallop, a shotgun approach, the kitchen sink. And like Barker tried to throw the kitchen sink at me in that debate by just quoting a ton of difficult Bible passages. So I had just like the most efficient and lean rebuttal possible to get through all of them and just read it verbatim. And it was just right on point. And I was prepared to do something similar with Steve to say, okay, I know he's going to bring up a lot of different points. And so I wanted to have it somewhat organized just to be able to have something to address all of these different points. But it was jarring just when he started going at the Council of Trent. I think, though, Gary, it did not help his case when he did this shotgun approach. And I asked other people who saw the debate that it's not impressive to them because it wasn't organized. So they didn't take away a clear overarching message from it about why they should not accept the Deuterocanon or accept the Protestant canon. And so even though it might seem kind of impressive, if you don't walk away with a single message, whereas I talked to people, they said, my opening, there's a effective.
Yeah. In fact, in the chat room, somebody just popped in while Steve was giving one of his statements, and they asked whether he's defending the Orthodox canon. So you're right. It was kind of incomprehensible because there wasn't a single message. Where when I debated Christie, I took maybe 3 points and I just tried to make it as clear as possible.
Right.
Because that way, at least the people will walk away saying, okay, well, this is what Machuda argued, whether they agreed with it or not.
Right. And that's the key.
Yeah. Yeah, William, I don't want to hog.
No, not at all. Gentlemen, y'all are fantastic. A lot of really good points there. And I think, Trent, the point that you made very, very clear, and I agree with you, as somebody that's been debating for quite some time, you would kind of expect your opponent to give a coherent opening, something that the audience would be able to kind of, grasp. From hearing him when he debated Gary and when he debated you a few days ago, I kind of got the idea that I was hearing an Audible book on 20 times speed.
Yeah, he was really trying. I would say he was doing the Gish Gallop. I'm very hesitant to accuse people. And for those who aren't familiar, Duane Gish was a young Earth creationist who would do this. He would, in debates on evolution, he would throw out as quickly as possible dozens of problems with the theory of evolution and so much information his opponent could never have enough time to respond to it all. And so that's pejoratively called the Gish Gallop. And so sometimes it has been used falsely against me. In my debate with Alex O'Connor a few months ago, I had a 9-step argument for God. And I was and I talked to a friend about it, John DeRosa, and he said, no, you didn't do a Gish Gallop. It was just a multi-step argument. But when Christie was doing it, yeah, I felt like he just threw out. And just the fact that he was talking so fast, that's similar to what you would do in high school forensics or high school debate. Like high school debaters are taught as part of just academic, as part of their sport, you talk quickly to make your points to get points with the judges. But the debates the three of us do, it's not about scoring points with a judge. It's about getting the audience to be persuaded. And it's just not persuasive when you talk that fast to people.
Yeah, you're not going to be reaching anybody. You really aren't. People are not going to come out really knowing anything, any point that you've attempted to get across. Another thing that I found quite peculiar from Christie, I've noticed a number. By the way, one thing that I do want to commend him on, and I commend him from the bottom of my heart, is I hope he's finally retired that argument on the Book of Revelation that I heard him shockingly use.
I was prepared to drop the hammer if it came up in our debate. I was really I would have been. I'm not sure. I would have been flabbergasted if he had continued to use it. Which those who aren't prepared, in a previous debate with Gary and with you, he has claimed that you can't trust the canons of the regional councils or Trent. You can't trust the Catholic Church because one of the councils at like Hippo or Carthage 397 did not include the Book of Revelation in it, which is not true. He derived that from an error in an appendix in Lee MacDonald's book, which if he had been reading MacDonald's book carefully, he should have obviously seen this was an error. One, because nobody else agrees with it. Yep. And two, in MacDonald's book on like page 393, he talks about Revelation in the book, but never says it was absent from the council.
Yeah, and another thing, as you probably know, Gary knows as well, Lee MacDonald is my friend. I picked up the phone and I asked Lee MacDonald what the issue was. When I heard that argument brought up from Christie, and funny enough, Lee MacDonald admitted, oh, you know what, that was an error, hoping to get that taken care of in a later edition. But here's for me, here's the major issue, Gary and Trent. The issue is this. When you open up a book, anytime you're writing, doing research, preparing for a debate, and you find a claim like that, you don't then adopt that and prepare to use that in debate. You go and you verify that the author has done the proper work by going to the first-hand material. And when Christie told me that you couldn't do that, I was shocked. Of course you can do that. You can go and you can look up the canon list. And when you do that, you'll find right there, the Apocalypse of John is listed right there.
Right.
That to me, for me, above anything else, Trent, and I don't know if you agree, above anything else is the lack of doing proper homework. And I find that to be a big issue. And I think for people that are Catholic or Orthodox or even evangelical, maybe you're on the fence from evangelicalism, because I know a few people wanted to tune in today that are a little bit on the fence. If you are, you should be even more confident at the veracity of these books when you realize that there's no argument that can really stand up to them.
Well, I want Gary's thoughts on this, because in the debate, I was also surprised in his closing statement. He really broke the rules of debate where he introduced new arguments. And one of them was straight out of Gary's little book. I got it right here, which was with Gary. See, this was, Gary, I think I got this from you. We were in person at a conference, right? And I got this from you. That was
Steubenville.
Yeah, at Steubenville, you gave me this. And it was so helpful because it addressed the claim he made that only 44% of the fathers at Trent adopted the canon, which was not true. That's relating to the question of attaching the anathema, not to the question of the adopting of the canon, which is one of the misrepresentations you had in this book. And he brought it up in his closing statement. And it was clear, William, like you're saying, he's getting this clearly from Webster or some other kind of secondary source arguing this, and not bothering to check it out with the primary source. But yeah, Gary, I'm grateful you covered that actually in your work.
Yeah, well, hey, you're welcome. I actually ran into that whole issue on somewhere on the web years ago. And, if like William said, you got to check the sources. You just can't take things for granted. And it actually comes from, of all things, a really badly worded phrase from Bruce Metzger, who's otherwise really good theologian, very precise. And well, I'm glad it helped because again, I think you kind of smacked that down really quick in regards to the 44% thing.
Right.
Were there things? I know I was shocked by a few things that I thought I corrected him factually on my debates. Was there anything that surprised you that you thought he would never bring up and he did?
Well, no, I think what surprised me, honestly, was that he didn't just make his positive case. He didn't like to say, here's why we should trust the Protestant canon. And Christie's argument is unique among Protestants. Like I haven't seen other people make an argument like his, for better or worse, about the idea of the Pharisaical canon being the true canon, and here's how we can know that. And so my opening statement was crafted thinking, well, if I were Steve, that's my main argument, and I'm going to run with my main argument. And having the negative, part of me was making a negative, a case for the Deuterocanon, from all these different sources. But also, I felt it was fair to address his main argument in my opening as part of my negative case, based on what he had said in his book. And I just assumed he'd probably bring out his strongest argument into the debate. So I ended up dropping some paragraphs from my opening statement because I felt I would confuse the audience in rebutting an argument that was never made in the debate at all. So I kind of was starting to run out of stuff to rebut at one point, except for, you were right, there are a lot of accusations in the beginning. So I just tried as best I could in my first rebuttal, because in my first rebuttal, I dealt with his opening and first rebuttal to just try to assemble them in a coherent manner so they would make sense. And I think that took the wind out of his sails for his kitchen sink approach, because I could systematically have an answer to quickly give for others. And for people who are listening who do debates, that really is the key, to be able to have systematic answers, especially when someone produces a plethora of arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was, one thing that floored me, Trent, was you brought up the Kaige recension, which is a Pharisaic recension that was made around the turn of the era, so like 1 BC, 1 AD, which is a killer for, a defeater at least, for his argument that the Pharisees held only to the Protestant canon.
Right.
And he claimed he never heard of it, but like I brought it up on my debate against him. And he also quotes A.C. Sundberg, which is one of the few scholars he actually quotes in his book. And that entire article he quotes, like immediately the paragraph afterwards, it's all on the Kaige recension. And it just floored me that he acted like he never heard of this before.
I'll tell you one thing that was interesting that I could have brought up as a clear rebuttal was he was trying to make the argument following Roger Beckwith's argument, that the Sadducees didn't really have a different canon than the Pharisees. Because he was asking, well, how do you know the Sadducees had a shorter canon? And I said, well, it's just, that's a generally accepted belief in New Testament studies, that it explains why the Sadducees didn't believe in the bodily resurrection. I could have just fired back and said, well, Steve, in your own book, you said the Jews did disagree. We just know the Pharisees had the right one. But it was almost like in the debate, he just dumped that argument and tried to almost say that the Jews all had the same canon, or at least that the Sadducees and Pharisees were in agreement, which I found to be really surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, Trent, that kind of puts a lie to what you said earlier, that you're a jack of all trades, because when he pressed you on the sources, you came up with the two earliest ones of Origen and Epiphanius. I would say probably 5% of Catholic apologists out there would have had the answer like you pulled it out. So you're being very humble that you're just dabbling in this stuff.
Well, I mean, it's I would say that I was versed enough for I know the material. I've written on it for Case for Catholicism. It's funny, debates are they remind me of like taking a final exam back in high school or college. It's like, oh yeah, I got the final exam in 2 months. I'll be on that soon. Oh, final exam's in 2 weeks. Better put all the books together. The final exam is tomorrow. Better really go over the notes very well tonight, just to have it all together. And it's easier. Some topics are the back of your hand. Others aren't as much. But the key for me was, I tried to have all my research really organized. Though it is funny, when I do a lot of this work, I know different people have different note-taking styles. And I have notes I put forward for rebuttals. But like the day or two before, I just kind of sat down and just read a bunch of books and just kind of absorbed it by osmosis is what I prefer to do than doing rigorous note taking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it showed in the debate. You did an excellent job. And like you said, the way you combat the shotgun approach is just to keep it narrowly focused and clear, because it's really the lack of clarity is really in your opponent's camp.
I'll tell you one thing, that when it comes to clarity and also tactical decisions I had to make, like the strongest argument he was trying to make doubts in Catholics are that the councils disagree with each other. And he was bringing up the case of First Esdras, which is, which can be hard, which even if you have enough time is difficult to explain to people, how it's a recension or compilation of previous Old Testament material, and trying to explain the difference between First and Second Ezra, like the difference between First, Second, Third, and Fourth Ezra versus First and Second Esdras or Third Esdras, because I mean that's hopelessly confusing to people to say, well, no, let's just talk about Ezra, Nehemiah, Esdras, and the Apocalypse of Ezra would be just easier. But when you use these terms and say, well, the council didn't have this, it didn't have that, I do think it does a disservice to the audience. You're just trying to score points instead of saying, well, just explain this all. And then as Gary, as you pointed out to me before the show, you have explained this to him, and he's just making a mistake on this.
Yeah. And it's almost like he wasn't listening, or I don't know, because he said some factual errors that I pointed out in my debate. For example, he claimed that the first person to split Ezra and Nehemiah, because they were once combined as one book, was Jerome. And in my debate, I pointed out that Jerome, in his preface to the Book of Kings, he says that both the East and West, the Greeks and the Latins, divide this book. And that was written like 2 years before Hippo. So obviously he couldn't be the first person to do that. But I put it in my debate, but when he was with you, it was almost like.
But there isn't really a contradiction, because I thought Carthage says just 2 books of Ezra, and what they try to say is, oh, it's Ezra and Nehemiah, and then this other recension. Like, well, no, but Augustine describes Ezra and Nehemiah as the 2 books of Ezra, so it's not a contradiction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the other thing too is he said some surprising things. Trent, I don't think he understands the argument about Trent not rejecting explicitly Esdras and the other things, because at one point he actually agreed with you and says that they didn't reject these books, and it's like, yeah, that's the point. They didn't reject the book.
But he takes that as like a kind of a slam dunk, saying we can't have confidence in the canon unless we have a closed canon. And I think, and I could have brought this out more explicitly in my replies, because he was asking about the Eastern Orthodox books. And I think it's important for Catholics too, who might have a misunderstanding of the canon, to be able to express this point clearly. Trent says what the sacred books are, and condemns those who condemn these sacred books. It says what the books are, not what they aren't. And so it leaves open. It's a very important question to leave open, like Psalm 151, 3rd Maccabees, even the prayer of Manasseh. Because, for example, the question, if the Orthodox ever come back into communion with Rome, we are going to have to confront this question: what do we do with the wider canon that they have? And so it's hypothetical. But, and as I said in the debate, what I would imagine would be, well, we would allow them to read them as scripture. They just couldn't enforce that upon others. And then maybe centuries later, after the reconciliation, there could be an understanding that this part of the deposit of faith, that these books, it's not like the Book of Mormon or something. These are ancient texts. They pass the test of antiquity. They've just been preserved in the East, and now they're more fully understood in the wider church, if that were to happen. As I said in the debate, like, I attend a Byzantine Catholic church during Lent or the Great Fast. We pray the prayer of Manasseh, but as a liturgical text, not as an inspired one.
Right. Yeah. And he seemed to completely miss the whole idea that the question was put to the Council Fathers as to whether they wanted an explicit condemnation of those that weren't affirmed.
Right.
And so the Fathers said, we don't want to do that. We'll just affirm these books and walk away. And then he says something surprising, and maybe, Trent, you know what he was getting at, but he said, but the Council of Florence did reject these books. But
I'm not sure what he was. I think he was trying to get at, Steve, trying to say that because there was a description either in Florence or another council about affirming only what was in like the old Latin Vulgate, maybe that's the best that I could get from there. But I didn't know what he was saying that they rejected these. I didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah, same here. In fact, I flipped open Florence just to reread it, and it just says that we accept it and venerate these books. In fact, it doesn't even use the word canon, so I don't know how.
So what's interesting though, with the books, I tried to turn it on its head a little, because it's an interesting question, like for the Orthodox and their wider canon, how to accept that. Like I would say to Christy, and I didn't get an answer to the debate, is suppose, I accept the pillars of Protestantism, sola scriptura, sola fide. Could I be a saved Christian, but I accept the Deuterocanon? Would I have to reject belief in the Deuterocanon to be either a Protestant or even to be saved under his view? And he seemed like you couldn't even do that, which I don't see how he could defend from his position.
Yeah, absolutely. One more point, then William, you could let loose. But Trent, I love how you also went on the offensive, and you gave him the Apocrypha Apocalypse challenge about Hebrews 11:35b.
Oh, totally.
Where in the Protestant Old Testament do you find these? Anybody that matches that full description, the best he could come up was Jeremiah, and I don't know how in the world he sees that being described there in the 35.
No, I wish I had more time to go with that, because I also had the question. I asked him point blank before we ran out of time. Like, you assembled 50 Protestant commentaries that connect Hebrews 11 and 2 Maccabees 7, Hebrews 11:35b and 2 Maccabees 7. And I asked him, look, are all 50 of them wrong, Steve? He's like, well, they're not wrong. They're just Saved by the Bell.
I wish you had a couple more minutes.
Totally.
Yeah.
But that was important for me to go to Scripture, and I think it's important for people, like if you do a debate on this subject, like the examples of where the deuterocanonical books are attested to in the New Testament, they're of varying strengths. There are clear examples and less clear. So like when you're in a debate, it doesn't matter what the topic is. You should always go with your strongest argument in a debate. Don't settle for a weaker one that's your pet argument. And I feel like the strongest ones really are Hebrews 11:35b, about those who are tortured to gain a better release and a bodily resurrection, and also the prophecy in Wisdom chapter 2 about God rescuing the Son of God from his enemies, which is a reference to Matthew 27:43. I picked those two because I saw in his book the different rabbit trails he goes down through the other references, but I felt like his replies on those particular verses were very weak. And I was looking forward to rebutting his rebuttals, but it just never came up.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. William, go ahead.
Y'all able to hear me all right?
Oh, yes.
Wonderful. Trent, I agree 100%. I felt you were about to hold his feet to the fire when the bell rang on 2 Maccabees. You were getting going there in Hebrews 11 and 2 Maccabees, the connection there. And I agree with you. The power within that text there is really, in my opinion, irrefutable. You bring up a really good point on whether or not he's going to disagree with all of those commentaries. One other thing that I would add as well, that Gary and myself have been talking about, is that there were fathers as well that saw that connection.
Right.
He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that because he hasn't done the research.
Right.
But and then even grammatically, I think the one area where he doesn't realize is it's very important is when the Greek in the Greek New Testament is lining up with something so clearly in the Septuagint text. It not only grammatically, even contextually as well.
Right. So I was hoping to get to that. I was saving that in my back pocket if that came up to connect these texts. But I do find it striking that in Hebrews 11:35, when it's talking about they were tormented, using the Greek word tupanizo, that word, we only find that construction in the Septuagint of 2 Maccabees 7. When you find, it's not a slam dunk, but when you find those very unique grammatic constructions, it provides A lot of evidence for a touch point. I mean, by itself, it may not mean much, but with everything else behind it, it really solidifies that we've got a case of a explicit citation to Maccabees, which is why all the Protestant commentaries Gary cites, it clearly agrees. And then he's got to just face the music here. At best, he could just say, fine, it's like Enoch, but we don't like it. Enoch cited in Jude, but we just don't think it's inspired. That would at least be the honest way to confront it.
Sure, and then he would run into the brick wall of the fact that as we go later on into history, Enoch is not included in those councils, whereas 2 Maccabees is. So I have a feeling he would have avoided that trend because he would have recognized that he would be falling. Either which way, he's going to fall into a trap, and it's going to be a big bear trap, because if he does take that position, he'll eventually run into the problem of these councils not having it there. And you bring up a really good point. Covering just Esdras and all of these issues, in my opinion, could take a lot of time. It could really take a lot of time. And I think you focusing, I mean, let's be quite honest.
That's one thing you don't have in a debate.
You don't. So, and I think you recognize, one thing I know you recognize, as somebody that also debates, you knew you didn't have to. The burden of proof was on him.
Right.
And he was not able to shoulder that burden of proof. One area that I felt, and I know why, one area I felt he was very weak in, and I say that, I can say that because I know Christy. I know even if he hears it, I consider him a friend, and I'll tell him personally. I think he was very weak in his usage of Augustine. I think he was off point there. To claim that Augustine differentiated, at least I got that, between canonical and ecclesiastical. I know you all didn't get a whole lot of time to go really in depth on that, but anybody who's read Augustine will know that Augustine clearly utilized the Deuterocanon as Holy Writ. And I find that to have been problematic of the statements he made about Augustine were very much in error.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Augustine is clear on that. I mean, other Protestant apologists will agree that Augustine believed the Deuterocanon was scripture. They attack his reasons for believing it, but they take that for granted.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. You brought up a really good point, and I kind of maybe want to pick your brain and pick Gary's brain.
Sure.
On the Orthodox canon. Very good point, by the way, in terms of liturgical use. That is a fantastic point. I've dialogued with Orthodox scholars before that have told me that even when it comes to Third Maccabees and what have you, that they don't view them, that they have no issue, they would have no issue calling them liturgical rather than canonical in the same manner as the other books. With that being said, what do you all think about the Ethiopian canon?
It's definitely more eclectic.
Right. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think do you think they view canon in the way we do? I mean, do you find it problematic? What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I'll defer to Gary's judgment on this more. I mean, I have a basic working knowledge of their wider canon, but I think that their approach to canon and text may be loose and kind of a parallel to maybe how the Essenes viewed a lot, that they just didn't have as strict criteria of marking canonical boundaries, and they just will take something if they recognize or see divine wisdom in it. But I would just see what Gary thinks.
Yeah, I did a little bit of reading on the Ethiopian canon, and from what I can tell from Ethiopian scholars, that to use the term canon like it's used in the West doesn't have any application in Ethiopian. And it could just mean holy writings or beneficial writings. I think, you have to take Ethiopia as certainly an outlier when you look at Christianity as a whole, especially since they were cut off from Christianity with Islam. There was a huge span of time, especially that's when they started developing their canon, where they were out of contact with the rest of the Christian world.
Right.
Yeah.
I totally agree, gentlemen. Trent, to kind of maybe pick your brain, do you think that maybe another, and Gary as well, you can chime in, do you think maybe another weak point with the Protestant position would be that when we kind of, we talk a lot about the Bible and what have you, when we get to the Apostolic era and the Ante-Nicene era, you have got a number of these fathers utilizing the Deuterocanon as Holy Writ. I mean, you've got Clement of Rome,
Right.
You have Barnabas, even Polycarp. I believe Polycarp cited Tobit, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Do you think that is problematic for the Protestant position on the canon?
Oh, I definitely think so, because, well, one big reason for it was, and what I cited to Steve, was he tried to make that argument that the Deuterocanon was not a part of the Septuagint. Now, of course, if he's going to make that argument, that requires a burden of proof. If it wasn't in the first century Septuagint, where did it end up in church history? And that's why I pushed back in the debate, saying, well, if it wasn't in the first century if it wasn't in the first century Septuagint, then how is Josephus citing Deutero-Esther? How is Clement citing these works, or Polycarp? And that's, of course, why I brought up the Kaige recension, which puts us right around the end of around 1 BC. That I think, for me, not just the citations, but that, although I don't really, I think a lot of other, well, I don't know. It's weird. Like, you'll basically have Protestant scholars. I guess there's two camps, to be honest with you guys. Like, there'd be the Christie, White, Roger Beckwith camp that will take the view, these very minority views that are favorable to their position, like that the Sadducees didn't have a separate canon, or the Septuagint, the first century Septuagint did not have the Deuterocanon, and try to make that argument because it really helps their position, versus other Protestant scholars like MacDonald or David De Silva or other people who say, well, yeah, it's in there. We just don't end up accepting it, but it was certainly there. I'm just not sure how to describe this approach that they're taking, but I do think that citing that is helpful to go after that more rigid Protestant apologist take on the canon. I guess I would say there's a Protestant apologist take on the canon and a Protestant scholar take on the canon. I think, Gary, you might agree with that. I would say that when you read all the literature, I would say there's a difference. The Protestant apologist take of White, Webster, Christie, and Beckwith. Beckwith is a scholar, but frankly, the other scholars treat him like an apologist.
That's true.
He has a predetermined view that he will argue for no matter what. And then just Protestant or non-Catholic scholars. I really do think there's two separate camps, and that's important to bring out in the Deuterocanon discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, William, if I could throw in a comment too, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Trent. When I was discussing the debate parameters with Steve Christie, I said I didn't want to talk about anything about inerrancy because I think it's a no-win. And besides that, I don't want to undermine people's faith by talking about difficulties.
Absolutely.
But you allowed it. So in a way, I give you kudos because that kind of opens up a whole can of worms as far as you have to really discuss why it doesn't work.
And I agree with you, Gary, that I don't want people to think that there are irresolvable errors in Holy Writ and in Scripture. But at the same time, if my opponent wants to use a patently bad argument, I'm not necessarily going to stop him. It's his right in a debate to use whatever and I said in the debate, this is the worst argument you could make against the Deuterocanon. And I'm willing to allow that, though, Gary, because so many other Protestant apologists use this argument. So I felt like it was helpful. It was worthwhile to address in the debate because you find this on CARM, Christian Apologetics Research Ministry. James White uses this argument. Webster does. It's a common one, so it does need to be resolved. And I think the key is to show, look, these Protestant apologists are being inconsistent, and that's why I took out of my bookshelf. Let's see. I think I put it back. I don't need to bring it for a prop here, but why not? It's YouTube. Here, I'll just grab it off my bookshelf. But I decided just for fun because it's video. This is McKinsey's Encyclopedia Biblical Errancy, and so McKinsey's an atheist, and he's like, look at all of these errors in the Bible. Now, a lot of these can be easily resolved. Some not so easy. Mm-hmm. And so my point, though, for Steve is to say, look, when you believe, Christians believe the Bible. I wanted to ask them, Christians believe the Bible is inerrant. Protestants will believe the proto-canon is inerrant, and they don't have to answer all of this to believe that. Mm-hmm. They don't have to. So if they don't have to do that for the proto-canon, why should I have to do it for the Deuterocanon? And Christie made it seem like, we do answer that. We've answered all of that, so there's no problems, which I thought was just such a weird reply, basically.
Yeah, I mean, what can you do at that point? You could call them on it and say, well, what do you say? How do you resolve this problem? But if you do that, then you run the risk of ruining people's faith, because
That's
they might
right.
say, yeah, can't resolve that.
But that's why I said, though, that even when it comes, like, if it were so easy to resolve, another problem is that Protestants will resolve the difficulties in different ways, in mutually exclusive ways. So then that means, no, wait a minute, then it's not easy to appear on the face of it, because, like take even contradictions in the resurrection narratives. Norm Geisler will reach a different conclusion than Mike Licona, or he would, rest his soul. They'll reach different Protestant apologists, like the contradictions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. If you're a young earth creationist, you're going to approach it way different than if you're more of an old earth or a theistic evolutionist. And so that's why I wanted him to see, look, Protestants answer these things differently. It's clear, at the very least, it's almost like, Gary, I was frustrated. It's like he wanted to deny not just that there were errors, because I agree with him, there's no errors in the Proto-Canon, but he claimed that the Deuterocanon has apparent errors, and that the Proto-Canon doesn't even have apparent errors, which I thought was just baffling. I think he said that in the debate, that the proto-canonical books don't have apparent errors, which is just baffling to me that someone would say it doesn't have things that just appear to be difficulties.
Yeah. And one thing that stuck out when he was talking about the blood of Abel argument,
right?
He goes way out on a limb and says, well, Trent, you might not know this, but the Jews had this way of referring to people through other people because they had similar names. And so even though Jesus says that the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, he's actually, referring to the son of Jehoiada. And I thought, and then he brings up Judith and Nebuchadnezzar. I thought, well, how come that's plausible, right, in Matthew, but it's implausible to give a solution with Judith?
Right. But it was funny even that it wasn't just Christie. And so I'm glad it was brought up, because one of the Protestant questioners in the Q&A, which Q&A is a fun part of the debate because it's a real wild card. You don't know what people are going to throw at you. And so it's interesting to see the the questions derived from me, some of them coming from other Protestants, like, okay, what's the argument? Because some of them may say, hey, my guy didn't bring up the best argument. Here's my question for you. One of them was just, well, Trent, aren't you embarrassed that in Tobit it says to burn fish guts to frighten away demons? As if that was just a slam dunk. Clearly, this isn't inspired because it contains this description from the angel to Tobit. And I said, in my reply, but look in the proto-canonical books. The first example that popped in my mind, which I could have articulated a little more clearly, was that in Genesis 30 about Jacob having the cows and using the speckled rods to try to produce different offspring of different colors to fool Laban. When we all know that's not how animal husbandry works. Clearly Genesis 31 makes it clear God was working through this folk practice. And so if he does that, to me, though, if I could go back, I would have just picked even a simpler example when Jesus uses mud and spittle to heal the blind man. He doesn't really. It's kind of gross. My insurance doesn't pay for mud and spittle to go to my eyes. The little remark, but it's God. He can use anything he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really does come down. And William, I'll let you.
No. Go ahead. I agree.
It really comes down to, if someone's going to say it's an error, how do you know that there's absolutely, positively no way to reconcile in any way, shape, or form this difficulty? Right. And so it really comes down to a person's personal opinion. Like for Judith, he didn't buy your treatment of Judith, but his treatment of Matthew, somebody might roll their eyes, like he's explaining away the obvious.
Right, and so it's interesting, and that's why I kept pointing out the point for people to take home is that you can't determine if something is inerrant unless you know it's inspired first. And that's the question we have to settle, because if you know it's inspired, you approach it knowing that any apparent error is apparent. And even if I don't know, which is what Norm Geisler does in his own book, When Critics Ask, that Geisler says, look, even if there's a apparent error in the Bible, our inability to resolve it does not mean that it's an error. It just means we may not have access to an ancient manuscript that resolves it, or ancient context, or an ancient lexicon to help us understand what a word means. And that's the same thing we need to apply there. I will say this, though, for apologists and others who want to confront other faiths, it teaches, the Deuterocanon and Protestants teach us a lesson in that we need to be careful when we make similar kinds of arguments against other religions and their sacred texts. Yeah. So 2 examples I bring up would be trying to disprove Islam by citing errors in the Quran, and then trying to disprove the Book of Mormon by citing errors in the Book of Mormon. You just must be careful. Don't go at it. Like, if you're going to try to cite an error, think to yourself, okay, if this were an error in my scripture, what is the best thing I could do to try to resolve it? Like, you got to pick something like, if I put all my muscle into trying to resolve this, because I've seen some people, go after the Book of Mormon because it says adieu in the translation, as if that couldn't been on ancient Egyptian or be something Joseph Smith translated. Like, that's a weak argument. If you're going to go after something in another text to show it's a contradiction, make sure you've exhausted the possibilities and give those people the same leeway you would want with your own texts.
Yeah, absolutely.
You gentlemen bring up really good points. The one thing that I frequently think when I hear about the apparent issue with the Book of Tobit is really major nitpicking. Yeah, because the fathers had no issue, and the massive amount that utilized the Book of Tobit as Holy Writ never had an issue with that. And I'm reminded of a gentleman I debated a year ago, John Loftus, an atheist, who, and I'm reminded of it very clearly because in the very same manner that Protestants can attack and do attack the Deuterocanon, you've got other people from the outside looking in find certain things within the proto-canon as ridiculous. Because John Loftus told me, man, I find that to be almost magic-like kind of, weird when you hear about the necessity to spread the blood of a lamb to avoid the angel of death. I find that to be absolutely ridiculous and crazy and what have you. So
you're right. That's not that far off from burning fish guts to keep away a demon.
Exactly.
That's such a good rejoinder. I'm going to remember the next time somebody gets mad about that. I'll say, "Oh, do you put blood above your door to keep away the angel of death?" And it's pretty on par.
I agree with you. I made the connection, Trent, when he brought that up to me. I thought, well, you remind me very much of the way Protestants attack the deuterocanonical books. When while they're doing that, they don't realize the proto-canonical text can be attacked the very same way. Not that I'm agreeing with the attack. No. I am not, but they're kind of really looking at it with blinders on, if you will.
Well, to be consistent, you should either treat them equally like an atheist does. An atheist would say they're both ridiculous, or treat them equally as a Catholic does and says these both apparent difficulties can be resolved. But you can't have one and not the other.
Yep, you can't. And it really does open up many more problems for them. And really a kind of area where I agree with you, gentlemen. If we're approaching the text as it being holy writ already, to me, it would make my stomach churn to try to attack maybe the book of 1 Samuel, which clearly, as you know, atheists love to zero in on issues that are, in many proto-canonical books. Oh, well, right. You've got problems here with the text or here or there. I wouldn't do that. Right. I wouldn't do that. Yet the approach to me, I think is a problematic approach, and I don't think it does anything for the case at all.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. So in a way, I think that line of argument really plays to the bias of the audience. If they're Protestant, they'd be more willing to accept things like that that's critical of the Deuterocanon and just automatically assume, well, the Proto-canon, that's easily solved.
Yeah, and I think also, well, one thing, a point to bring up when it comes to resolving these difficulties, we should also, as Catholic apologists, just like with the Proto-canon, say, look, there's a diversity of ways to explain these different apparent difficulties. Now, when Judith came up, I decided, fine, I'll throw something out there. I picked one avenue, which was saying that the genre of the book is not literal history. That is one option. It's not the only option. I saw in some YouTube comments people saying it is literal history. It's referring to Nebuchadnezzar by a different name. And that's fine. You can make that argument. There's multiple ways to go about it. So I think there's a liberty to do that. The reason I did that was I just picked what would be the strongest to articulate in a succinct manner in a debate. And to show that it wasn't just an ad hoc response, I quoted other Protestants who would like to undermine Judith or undermine the Deuterocanonicals, who would agree with the same thing, like Luther. And I do the same thing with Tobit in my book, showing how Luther and Bruce Metzger and Kaiser talk about this isn't strict history, it's like a didactic fiction. And also even where Pope St. John Paul II talks about, he says in one of his audiences, he said, the books of Tobit, Judith, and Esther, although dealing with the history of the chosen people, have the character of allegorical and moral narrative. So, that's one option. It's not the only one. Mm-hmm. But so we should recognize there's other ways to explain these apparent difficulties. But I think people have to recognize, look, when you're in a debate, you have to be very conscious and prudent about the solutions you offer. And technical, difficult to explain solutions are not great in a debate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Luther thought it was a holy parable. And I liked how you turned it that, well, Steve, are you saying that Luther was ignorant and, offered something that was implausible?
Well, like he tried to say it was an easy way out. I'm like, look, I'm not just quoting Catholics here. I just quoted two sources, Martin Luther and then Carrie Moore, who wrote a commentary on Judith for I think it was for Anchor Bible or the Word Biblical Commentary series. So it's like these are two, early modern Protestant scholar and a contemporary modern Protestant.
Yeah. Another thing, gentlemen, that I don't think he was aware of, and Gary and myself have talked about it a ton, is that early on, when even towards his middle phase, before Luther really began to disparage the Deuterocanon vehemently, when he was dialoguing, going back and forth with Johann Eck, if you notice, Eck quotes from the Deuterocanon a ton, and you don't hear Martin Luther going off the rails when Eck is cited from Tobit and many of these other books. So there's different stages of Luther, and I'm sure Protestants wouldn't like the fact that I believe it, Gary believes it, I'm sure you know as well, Luther was quite the flip-flopper when it came to the canon.
Right, yeah. When he starts getting backed into a corner on it, then he does the same thing with the letter of James. Now, he didn't ever throw it out of the canon, but he was very pessimistic towards it just because it was being cited so much in the debate over justification.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So maybe it's a good time to tell people in the chat if you have any questions for Trent, because I know Trent's going to have to get going soon. Maybe we could take a question.
The office closed a half hour ago, so hopefully I didn't get locked in here with the alarm on, but it should be all good.
Yeah, so send your questions in.
Sure.
Yeah, I think ultimately when it comes to trying to use inerrancy to determine canonicity, there's no way you can disprove that a posited solution can't be true. Let me give you an example. Like using Luther's analogy that it's a parable, someone could say, well, there's an awful lot of historical data in Judith, so obviously it can't be a parable. Well, who's to say it's not a new literary genre and it's unique? You can't rule that out. So it's kind of how in the world could you ever prove that negative, that no, there's no possible solutions whatsoever?
And that's why, like, when we argue against other religions, that's why I don't think, like, if I'm arguing against Islam or the Book of Mormon, I'm not going to say Mormonism is false because of this particular error in the Book of Mormon or this error in the Quran. I might use it as a cumulative case to say this should make us very skeptical of it, but then point to the central pillar and say, but we don't have justifying evidence for Joseph Smith's revelation or Muhammad's revelation. So I think that that's why in these debates, when it talks about the Deuterocanon, we shouldn't be talking about inerrancy. We need to talk about how do we know something is inspired or not inspired? How do we know the Book of Mormon, the Quran, the Proto-Canon, the Deuterocanon? How do we know what is and isn't inspired? That's what we need to be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have a question from Lisa, and this is good for Trent and William. Do you have a non-biased account of Luther versus Eck debate? Some accounts lean emotionally.
I wouldn't be familiar with that off the top of my head, no. So, I just have the standard historical works that I would go to, but I don't know if William has any.
Yeah, I do. Get a hold of the Enchiridion. You will note that has not even been published by a Catholic publishing house. That is a Protestant publishing house. They don't have very positive things to say about Johann Eck there. They're a bit fair, but they're very Protestant. But they have the debate that went down between the exchange between Luther and Eck. You can find a good amount of it recorded in there. I definitely recommend getting a hold of that. Gary, in fact, the last time I saw Gary, we were geeking out over that book, going through that book. Remember that, Gary?
That's right. Yeah. The next question is kind of interesting because in my debate, I think the best question that was asked in my 2 debates with Christy was a questioner. It was Dave Armstrong's question, where he tried to spoke out Christy and say, basically, what would it take for someone to prove that the Catholic canon is true? He's asking for a defeater. Right. And Christy basically says nothing, and so it's emotionally based. Now, the question is, should someone debate Steve on justification? That might help convert him.
I don't think debates are the way to convert an individual. I look at debates as an opportunity. I consider debate to be an opportunity to present an issue to people for them to more deeply consider it. So, we've had already over, I think, 10,000 views in my debate with Steve. The debate I just did with Alex O'Connor has hit over 100,000 views on the existence of God. The point of I do debates is not to convert that other person. I would love for them to convert. I pray for them. But it's to help the people watching to consider the issue and to consider the arguments I put forward when they may not be willing to read an article on the Deuterocanon, but they might enjoy watching a debate and then walk away from it and say, oh, I didn't realize there was that evidence for the Deuterocanon. I'm going to go and check this out a little bit more. So when it comes to justification, there's always an opportunity to debate people. And it's a topic, however, so when it comes to converting the other person, I don't think that is the main goal, but it may happen, but it's to reach it to other people. Though I will say that when you do debates, and I had this drama a little recently on social media with James White, actually, because people have been asking him, why won't you debate Jimmy Akin or Trent Horn on Sola Scriptura? Because he did a rebuttal to me on Sola Scriptura, and I said, fine, let's do a debate on it if you want to finish it off. And he was saying, well, no, I want to debate I think the topic he proposed is resolved. Pope Francis is the infallible vicar of Christ and a trustworthy guide to all doctrine. Something like that. And I said to him, look, a good debate resolution is narrow. Like, you're jumbling a bunch of different things, some objective, others kind of fuzzy. Like, what is a trustworthy guide to all doctrine? Like, you're bundling it together. That's not helpful for a debate. And I think that could happen with justification, that like justification has different facets to it. And so I think a good debate on the subject should really restrict on, imputation, or really on what are the role of works in salvation, just to be very, very clear on a. So if I were to do a debate with him or someone else, I'd want it to be a pretty narrow topic.
Yeah. William, any comments?
I totally agree with you. And the very reason you would have to make it quite narrow, as Trent, sanctification alone could take up multiple debates.
Right.
Multiple. I remember when I debated James White's very own Turton fan, we were originally going to debate Sola Fide, and we realized to have that kind of a debate, it would probably take 20 hours. We didn't have that time. So we focused on the book of Romans alone, Romans 3. Right. And that alone took about 2.5 hours. So you need to narrow debates down. And I agree with what Trent said. I don't go into any debates with the mentality that, hey, I have got to convert the guy that I'm debating. You need to debate with the mentality that you want to reach people out there that maybe don't know the truth. Maybe they don't realize that Catholicism has a very logical and intellectual defense, and people that may be stuck in darkness without knowing that you can defend the bodily resurrection and many other things. That at least is how I approach. I agree completely with what you say there, Trent. And I think you will you will encounter much better results if you approach a debate in that way.
Yeah.
I think, Gary, I think I probably got to head home here in a sec. We got the newborn baby at home, other good things. So I apologize I couldn't be here longer, but it was a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. No, we appreciate it, Trent. Thanks so much for coming on.
Sure, I'll be praying for you, brother.
I appreciate it. Thank you, guys, and love to come back on for another topic.
Absolutely.
Great.
All right. See you later.
Okay. Bye-bye. Yeah, William, we got one more question, but I think we could probably handle it.
Yeah, hopefully.
Did any council before Hippo and Carthage use the deuterocanonical books as scripture?
Yeah. Well, you'll frequently hear the Council of Rome 382 brought up. The one thing that I will be caught flat-footed on is the date of Antioch. I believe the count.
269.
Okay, there we go. Gary, wow, you are the man. And I believe Antioch quoted Sirach, I think.
Yes.
I think Antioch used Sirach. The reason I know Antioch off the top of my head is right now, Thursday nights I give a Trinity class, and on the road to Nicaea, you encounter Antioch where there is that condemnation of Paul of Samosata, and later on, Arius, of course, would pick up the kind of argumentation that he was utilizing. And very, very good question, by the way, for the person that may have been wondering. Antioch was very pivotal in the history of Christendom. Even though it was not ecumenical, it definitely set the groundwork for what would come at Nicaea, because at Antioch, you have the clear language being laid out that the fact that the angel of the Old Covenant, the angel of the Lord, is indeed the pre-incarnate eternal Christ. So very significant that council utilized the deuterocanonical book. Gary, if you can think of any others.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed that you came up with that. I actually had to cheat and look at my book.
Oh, you did? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
And why Catholic Bibles are bigger. I also look at councils. There's not a lot before Hippo, because Hippo's 393.
Right.
You're absolutely right. Sirach, they quote it as it is written, so it's a formal citation, 269. Of course, you have Nicaea, where Jerome claims that Nicaea affirmed Judith in some way. Now, we don't have the Acts of Nicaea, and there is no declaration about Judith, but Jerome was very familiar with Nicaea, so it very well could have came up as being used as a proof text for something by the Council Fathers, although it didn't make it into the official declarations.
Yeah. Really great question. I did not expect that to be brought up. I was caught flat-footed on the year there. You bailed me out there when it comes to the year. But another thing I would add, Gary, even though we don't have that record of Nicaea, we don't have the Acta. It's very likely they did utilize it. And even if Jerome would have been in error there, the very fact that kind of a statement was made shows you the importance of the fact that the Deuterocanon had already at that quite early in history. You don't have anybody coming out and saying, "What are you talking about?" A council would never have utilized the Deuterocanon in that kind of a manner. You just don't have that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, William, maybe we'll just do one more question, then I'm going to have to get going. Just ask, if archaeology ever comes out with evidence that the Protestant canon was the Pharisee canon, is it okay for the church to have expanded the OT?
What was that? Could you run that by me again? I was replying in the chat. What was that question again?
It's okay. Yeah, if archaeology ever, let's see, it scrolled up, so now I can't see it. If archaeology ever find proof that the Pharisee canon was that of the Protestant canon, is it okay for the church to have expanded the OT?
Well, the way I would answer that would be, number one, archaeology is not going to find that. Number two, the canon that we utilize and the canon that we stick to would have been the apostolic one. And there's nothing that could ever be found in history outside of what we already have that show that the apostles utilized the Deuterocanon as holy writ. I see somebody in the chat believing, yeah, I have definitely read that, Emil, and I've read the condemnations of that as well. There is no, to claim that an Orthodox would adopt the Protestant canon is absolutely ludicrous. There's none that would ever adopt that. In fact, if you read the absolute shock at Lecar when he adopted Protestant kind of theology and canon, the fact that Orthodoxy had to affirm that they held to the Deuterocanon as Holy Writ shows you that Orthodoxy are on this exact page as Catholicism are. We are brothers in arms in this issue, and for good reason. The canon is apostolic, and that is why we believe the Deuterocanon are Holy Writ.
Yeah. Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms. For in regards to that question, though, it's fine if the Pharisees, of course, it's possible the Pharisees and the Hillel school accepted the Protestant canon. That's something actually Trent and I and William concede. But there was also the Shammai that had a few books less. And there was many other sects too, like the Essenes had a wider canon. Trent brought that up in the debate. The thing is, although it's interesting what different Jewish sects may have had different collections of sacred books, for Christians, it means nothing, because ultimately our canon comes from Jesus, who knew which books were inspired and which ones weren't. That was handed down through his inspired apostles. And
Augustine says that. He says that in, I hope that I may have my notes open. If not, I am going to be caught a little flat-footed. I'm trying to remember the name on Christian Doctrine, Book 2. He does note that the very fact that the canon we hold to was definitely established by Christ. So right there that we recognize the language being utilized there. And after he makes that comment, he notices that it was apostolic. He then goes on to list the deuterocanonical books along with proto-canonical.
Yeah, very good. Man, William, I wish we could stay longer. There's such great comments. By the way, I have a 2-part video reply regarding the blood of Abel, the blood of Zechariah. That's available here at the Apocrypha Apocalypse. Guys, check out the Apocrypha Apocalypse Challenge. Share it with your friends because I'm interested to see if anybody can come up with a single character from the Old Testament that fits the description in Hebrews 11:35. By the way, folks, also, William, why don't you tell them about some of the videos that you're about to upload?
People, if you know anybody that is a Latin American or a Latin speaking person that knows only Spanish or knows both languages, we have got incredible videos coming soon, either tonight or early in the morning. Check it out. We're going to have a ton of material on the Deuterocanon with quotes from the fathers. I'm not aware of a lot of these in being available in Spanish, but you're going to find a ton of them only here in this channel, where you've got the early fathers giving their testimony to the Deuterocanon as Holy Writ, and we're going to provide to you the translation, a ton of really good material coming up. And really, not only that, but Gary and myself, we're going to keep giving you all incredible material because we love talking about the canon.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, folks, if you want to support William and I, because it is expensive getting this primary source material and copies like that, go to Patreon and look up William. He's under Patristic Pillars, and I'm under Gary Machuda. We appreciate your support.
Amen.
William, any last words before we go?
I have had an incredible evening with everybody here, everybody that came to watch, with the brother Trent and with you, Gary, and I look forward to doing many more. And my recommendation, if you are watching, there's got to be a button right down there. If you have not already subscribed, right down there, make sure you subscribe because we got a lot of very good content coming your way.
Yes, absolutely. And again, Trent, if you're watching the end of this, thanks again for coming on the show. You are the man. So anyway, from the Apocrypha Apocalypse, I'm Gary Machuda and William Albrecht. We say have a great night. Bye-bye, everyone.